Right, so welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. My name is still Magnus Nielsen, and what I'm doing at the present moment is continuing with my story about the murder of Martha Tabram. I told you how she'd gone out with this lady called Pearlie Poll. She'd taken a young guardsman, a private, up to George Yard Buildings. The site of George Yard Building is just directly in front of you. And I told you, I think, that at 5 minutes, or should I say quarter of an hour to 4:45, a man called John Reeves, who was a tenant of George Yard Buildings, came down the stairs to find the body of a woman sprawled out, flat on her back, lying in a pool of blood. Of course, he didn't know who this woman was, so he dashed out into the street, and this street here is called Wentworth Street. Wentworth Street runs from east to west, and he immediately bumped into a police officer, a man called Thomas Barrett. And so he and Thomas Barrett went straight back to George Yard Buildings to find out more about this woman. And then Thomas Barrett stayed with the body while he told John Reeves to go and get Dr. Killeen from his home and surgery, which was then in Brick Lane. I will take you to Brick Lane a little bit later on. But anyway, what happened was that Dr. Killeen arrived here at 5:30, and then at that point John Reeves excused himself because he had to be at work, and work started early for working people in those days. So that left the police officer, Thomas Barrett, and Dr. Killeen to deal with this dead body and to get it organised for to be taken to the mortuary where Dr. Killeen would conduct the autopsy. So the rest of the morning was spent by the doctor. He took a photograph, or he got a photographer to come in and take a photograph of the deceased woman for the purposes of going around the various common lodging houses to be able to identify her. That's the first thing they had to do. Then he conducted his autopsy on the body, and he decided that the death had taken place by a stab to the chest from a broad-bladed knife, very sharp knife, which he thought might have been a dagger. But in addition to the single stab, there'd been 38 other stabs to the torso of what was then a dead woman by means of a penknife, and that, of course, is really rather strange and weird that somebody would take the interest, a morbid interest, in stabbing a dead body. So that gave the police the problem they had was, first of all, to identify this particular woman and then work out what time she died. Well, they spent the afternoon. That was Inspector Edmund Reed, the detective inspector, the man who was in charge of detection at Whitechapel. He went to interview all the residents at George Yard Buildings, and he got some interesting information. He got some interesting information from a couple called the Mahoneys. That's Joseph and Elizabeth Mahoney. They said that they had returned to the building at 1:40 in the morning. They went straight home. They didn't notice anything unusual. If Martha had been stabbed at that time and if she was dead, then they would have tripped over the body. So what happened was that Elizabeth, almost immediately she returned home, she came straight out into the street, into Wentworth Street, to do a little bit of light shopping for some food to make her supper. And they made supper very quickly, and then both went to bed, and they were in bed at 2:30, and neither of them heard anything strange. Then at 3:30 we had another resident, a man called George Crow, told the police that he came home, and as he came home walking up the stairs, he saw a body on the landing, which he assumed to be somebody who was just sleeping rough for the night. That wasn't entirely surprising. They'd had a very bad summer and the weather was extremely unpredictable, so he thought no more about it and then went home. And it wasn't really until John Reeves came downstairs that he found this body. So they reckoned that the murder must have taken place around about 3 o'clock in the morning. That's to say, give or take half an hour or so. And then the police officer, Thomas Barrett, recalled that earlier that morning, around about 2 o'clock, he was on duty in Wentworth Street, and he encountered a guardsman. He asked him what he was doing. He said he was waiting for a chum who had gone with a girl. And that gave Barrett the idea that he might be the murderer. And in order to check his suspicions, they decided that what they would do is go the following day, the very next day, which would have been Wednesday. That would have been Wednesday the 8th, to the Tower of London, where the Grenadier Guards were stationed. So that's what they did. They had an identification parade. And an identification parade means that you get all the guards to come out and they line up, and Thomas Barrett goes down and inspects each one to see if he can actually recognize the man that he was walking. Remembering, of course, that it was dark. Thomas Barrett picked out 2 people he thought were likely, but it turned out that they had perfect alibis, so that exercise was rather futile, to say the very least. So that was Wednesday the 8th, and then on the Thursday the 9th, Mary Connolly, Pearly Poll, turns up at the police station, and she came to complain really about the activities of a man she called the Leather Apron. The Leather Apron apparently ran a gang of youths, hooligans, who used to make a practice of assaulting prostitutes in the area, beating them up, and then robbing them of their money. She was then asked by the police if she would come and attend another identification parade. This was the second one at the Tower of London, and this was something that she only agreed to very reluctantly, because it was just a sort of code of honour among the women that she worked with, that you don't get involved with the police any more than you have to, and you don't identify your clients. Now, what I'm doing here, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to turn around and to give you an idea. This is the crossroads. I'm in Wentworth Street still, and looking directly ahead of me is old Montague Street. And then leading off on the left-hand side, we have Brick Lane. That goes all the way up Brick Lane, and then down on the other side we have Osborn Street, and that takes us all the way down to Whitechapel High Street. And I say, after being a Ripper researcher now for about 10 years, I've come to a conclusion that such evidence that we have points to the fact that Jack the Ripper must have been living somewhere in this immediate neighbourhood. So this is my theory, ladies and gentlemen, that Jack the Ripper lived around here. Haven't proved it yet, but it's just a theory. What's also interesting about here, we have Brick Lane, the corner of Brick Lane and Wentworth Street. There was a lady called Emma Smith who was assaulted on the 4th of April of that year by this gang of young hooligans who beat her up, took her money, and one of them thrust a very sharp object, we don't know what it was, it might even have been a broken bottle, into her groin, so she bled profusely and she was just left by herself. She staggered back to her common lodging house and was then taken by another resident up to the London hospital. She died the day after. So anyway, that was Emma Smith. She was, some people include her, she's certainly among the Whitechapel murders, but whether she was actually a Jack the Ripper victim again is still disputed. Now, I was telling you, let's come back to our story. I was telling you how Mary Ann Connolly was reluctant to go down to the Tower of London to help with this ID parade. Anyway, nevertheless, what happened was that she had absconded. Now, on the Thursday afternoon, the inquest into the death of Martha Tabram took place. The inquest was conducted in order to determine the cause of death. And that's when Dr. Colleen gave his evidence and the police gave their evidence and the residents at George Yard Buildings gave their evidence. And the coroner, a man called George Collier, considered all this and thought, well, the police obviously have a lot of work to do, so what he decided to do in the end was to adjourn the inquest until the 23rd. That was give the police another fortnight to see what sort of evidence they could come up with. So the inquest was adjourned. I'm just turning around now into Green Dragon Yard, which you can see ahead of me. That's another one of these little side streets which may have been a place where Jack the Ripper lived. I just point that out. I don't know for certain, but it's always possible. So as I was saying, then coming back, they've adjourned the inquest, they've asked this Mary Ann Connolly to go and conduct an identification parade. She decided she actually didn't want to do that, and she didn't turn up. So she was missing. She was missing for the whole of Friday. The police were looking for her. They couldn't find her on the Friday, and they couldn't find her on the Saturday. And eventually, it wasn't until the Sunday that they found her in a place called Covent Garden. That's very much to the west end of London. So eventually what they did is they brought her back for the third ID parade, which Mary Connolly attended. And as she was looking at the guardsman, she said that, according to her memory, the guardsman that she was with was wearing a white band in his and so this obviously wasn't the Grenadier Guards, it was the Coldstream Guards. Now the Coldstream Guards are stationed not in the Tower of London but in the Wellington Barracks, which are very close to Buckingham Palace. So what then had to happen was that they made another ID parade. They arranged that for Wednesday the 15th. On the Monday evening, Henry Tabram, by that time he was living in Greenwich, he was reading the reports in the papers about this murder, which had become something of a sensation, and how they didn't know what the name of the deceased was. Was she Martha? Was she Emma? Was her surname Tabram or Turner or even Stapleton? He thought he'd better come along to the police, so he did that on the Tuesday morning, and he was taken to the mortuary where he confirmed the identity of his wife. The following day, the Wednesday, this is Wednesday the 15th, the morning, that's when Mary Ann Connolly goes again to the Wellington Barracks this time and has a close inspection of the guardsmen and just decides that she just selected two people at random, and they were investigated, and it was decided that they had perfect alibis and they didn't have to worry. And so that put the police in a predicament. They really abandoned this whole idea that the murderer was the guardsman. It's just as well, really. It's quite possible that what happened was that Martha Tabram had finished her business with the guard at perhaps about 1 o'clock and then gone out into the street, and that's when she picked up Jack the Ripper. So Jack the Ripper was probably her second client for that early morning. The inquest resumed on the afternoon of Thursday the 23rd of August, and after due consideration taking evidence, the police could come no further forward, and the jurors decided that the death of Martha Tabram was the result of murder by person or persons unknown. That was the formula they used, and that was the formula they would use many times over and over again. Anyway, what I'm going to do is clock off for now, but I'll see you again in my next video, and I'll be talking about the place where Martha Tabram lived, and also many of the other victims also lived.